Thank you, Josh, and welcome to all of you into the Fellows Dining Room. Uh, at our dining room table, it's virtual. Wish you were here so we could share a meal together and talk about these things. But I'm addressing you from this space, and I'm glad to have you here with us. So this series, as many of you know, if you've been following it, in this series, we're asking a question of great consequence for our times. I think one of the most important questions we can possibly ask, what is a human? And we've been getting at this from various angles. And tonight I want to look at one of our standout qualities. I think something about us that sets us apart from everything else. I want to explore how we quest for an understanding of our worlds. We are fundamentally, as humans, knowledge seekers. We have the kind of awareness of the world that wants to make sense of it. The great French philosopher Blaise Pascal described man as a thinking reed. Man is but a reed, he said, the most feeble thing in nature, but he is a thinking reed. And I think it's being a thinking reed that makes for this possibility of putting the world under our investigation. It was the great Greek philosopher Socrates who reminded us that the unexamined life isn't worth living. And that implies, of course, that we can examine life. We have this kind of awareness that permits that. And this is so fundamental, Socrates is saying, that if we forego the examination of life, we forgo life itself. It's not worth living. Now, it's interesting that even within the classification of our species, the one assigned to us by Linnaeus, he called humans Homo sapiens. You think about that for a moment. Sapiens is rooted to the Latin word sapienta, which is the word for wise. Homo, wise ones. And essentially, wisdom is a depth insight on the world we live in. Deep insight into our awareness of the world. That's wisdom. So Homo sapiens are wired for this. We're designed for it. And where nature is just completely indifferent to us, it has no awareness of us, it's unmoved by our existence, we, on the other hand, can't be unresponsive to nature and all the other dimensions of reality. Nature is unmoved, unaware. We're the opposite. We're aware, and so we want to examine. We need to know. So as we examine tonight how we come to know the world, you will see a feature belonging to our existence that definitely adds to the enchantment account. And I want to show you, if I can, how we're purposely designed to mind the world, to attend to it in a very special way. And I believe this is part of the wonder of our uniqueness as humans, the wonder of our human existence. And it adds a great deal to our understanding of what we are when we see ourselves as knowledge creatures. So tonight we're asking, how do we make sense of the world as knowledge seekers? How do we examine it? And how does this examination make life worth living? So I want to step back as I begin and ask this question. What kind of world do we mind as humans? What kind of world do we mind as humans? Now, here I want to draw on the work of a German philosopher, a man called Joseph Pfeiffer, and his remarkable book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And in this book, the German philosopher argues that every living entity, that is, everything possessed of biological life, has a world. As he says, it is in the nature of a living thing to have a world, to exist and live in the world, in its world. To live means to be in a world. So to be a living entity is to have a world and to be in it. And the reason every biological entity has a world is because of what he calls a life principle in the entity that allows it to be related dynamically to the world it's in. So every biological organism has the possibility for a reactivity to a world beyond itself because it's alive. And that reactivity creates a field of relations. So take the plant as an example. The plant is a living organism with a biological life principle. And this allows its root system to have reactivity in a field of relations. And what's that field of relations? Well, basically dirt. Dirt is its worlds. The roots are submerged in the soil. And its reactivity within that soil allows the roots to extract nutrients to support its life. But here's the caveat, and Piper is very strong in this. The plant never goes beyond the horizon of its own world, its field of relations. It's limited to that world it's in. Now, Pfeiffer's point is that the more complex the life principle in a living thing, the greater the range and field of relations. There's an extension, given the complexity of life principle, in terms of the horizon of world or multiple worlds. So animals go beyond plants because they have a life principle that includes sense perception. So that makes for a wider field of relations, a greater range and subtlety in its reactivity. So think of a rabbit munching some grass by the side of the road. Its reactivity, its world includes an audio awareness of cars whizzing by. Its nose is twitching for signs of danger it picks up through scent. And it has another awareness of its world through sight. It can see. It is sensory. So that's the world the rabbit is in. And it takes in everything within that immediate environment. But again, that's as far as the world of a rabbit goes, all within the horizon of the perceivable. Now, when it comes to humans, we have a field of relations that extends far beyond what's immediately perceivable. There's something about the life principle that we possess that vastly increases the horizons of our awareness. As Thomas Ligotti puts it, in truth, we have only one foot in the natural environment of this world. Other worlds are always calling us away from nature. And that is true because of consciousness. This was my second talk, the fact that we have this within that allows for a field of relations that extends outwards in all kinds of ways. We soar to worlds unknown. And that's why humans can mine worlds that other sentient creatures have absolutely no awareness of. The Canadian psychologist and sociologist Ernest Becker describes this as the mind flying out of its limits. He says the mind flies out of its limits in the puny body and soars into a world of timeless beauty, meaning, and justice. And this is how men come to exist in largely fabricated worlds of their own contrivance and derive their basic sustenance from these fabrications. Now, I'm not so sure about the second part of that quote, because I'd like to clarify and say that when our minds soar, it's not to fabrications, to inventions, to invented worlds, but rather to real worlds that are beyond the borders of nature. That's Roger Scruton's phrase, that there are worlds beyond the borders of nature. So we live as humans in a universe that's crammed with meaning, and that makes for many worlds. It's what the poet Jared Manley Hopkins is conveying in one of his most well-known poems. I just love this. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. So it's because of this flaming out nature of reality that our field of relations that we're designed for is expanded. And that's why the world has so many horizons for a human to mind. So the scope of our reactivity is enormous. And our inner life, our consciousness allows for this kind of mining. So there's something about our inner life principle that doesn't restrict us to our immediate environment. There's something about human awareness that liberates us from narrow perception. And that's why our minds can fly out of its bodily limits. And that makes for a massive broadening of the world that we attend to. So it's this factor that we have these fields of relations that move outward, that make us special as knowledge seekers. We have the capacity to mine multiple worlds. So you think of the world of atoms, the world of physics. We can mine the cosmos, the universe to some degree, the world of feeling, the world of human psychology, the world of logic, the world of truth, the world of education, the world of social relations, the world of media, the world of the digital, a whole new world today, the world of economics, the world of beauty, the world of morality, the world of virtue, of love, and of religion. So many fields of relations that we have the possibility to react to relate to mine, to attend to. And of course, with language, we have the possibility to put names to these various fields and worlds. And actually, the simple act of naming these worlds actually opens the door to worlds that we're in, these multiple worlds that we occupy. So this is the wonder of our knowledge seeking. We can mine multiple worlds. And of course, it's our ability to mine multiple worlds that makes us ask questions. Confronted by a vast range of horizons, we can't help but be the questioners. In fact, the question is the most important tool for minding our worlds, for making sense of them. As Abraham Joshua Heschel said, we ask because the world is too much for us, because the known is crammed with marvel, because the world is replete with what is more than the world as we understand it. So because of this, because it's so crammed with marvel, we have to ask questions. There's a painting that I think quite nicely reflects the multiple worlds that exist for us as humans. This painting is called The Triumph of Truth, painted in 1847 by the Italian painter Luigi Mussini. And knowledge in the middle is there as truth, as veritas, right in the center. This is naked truth on an altar. And actually before the altar, you've got Philip. And Philip is baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. So that reflects a religious world. And then to Philip's right, you've got the philosophers. There's Socrates there, and Plato and Aristotle. Here are thinkers who minded the world of ideas. There's another horizon. Then in the foreground a little bit, you've got the artists. Giotto is there. Aesthetics is a whole other world and horizon that we can explore and mind. To the left of the altar, you've got the great scientists, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Kepler, Pascal, Christopher Columbus even gets a look in. And so there it is, the various horizons that we can mind because we have these field of relations. The world is charged with the grandeur of God, and our inner life is designed. Inner life principle has this reactivity that can reach out and attend to this. So that's what we mean by minding the world. We're in a world, all of us, and as humans, we have multiple worlds that we can attend to. Now I want to move on and look at how we mind and attend to our worlds. How do we do this? And I'd like to suggest that there are two levels of minding. This is an insight given to us by a great 20th century Christian philosopher from the Netherlands. He has a name which is very hard to spell, let alone pronounce, but he's one of my favorites. His name was Herman Dooyeweerd. And when Dooyeweerd discusses the knowledge enterprise, he's very careful to distinguish between what he calls pre-theoretical knowing and theoretical knowing. And he was careful to argue that our minding the world doesn't begin in thinking. No, first we are addressed by the worlds. We're addressed by the world in its various dimensions and horizons, so it's presented to us. We could even say it's presenced to us. And this presentation of the world to us, in the first level of minding, it's one where everything is interwoven. We receive it as a whole, as a oneness, as a unity. And there's something in our consciousness that allows for a rich receptivity of the presented worlds. Now, in this first stage of minding, as the world is present to us, we don't reflect on what's going on. We just take it in. Dooyeweerd calls this naive experience. And that's why knowing in this stage is the pre-theoretical stage of minding. It's pre-reflective. So our attending the world begins here. The world comes at us in different ways, in different forms. It could be viewing a sunset in a quiet spot on the beach. That's what that's what addresses you, and that's what you attend to. It could be sitting in your lounge on the couch watching a movie. That's your world. It's presence to you. Or it could be having a lovely meal with friends. Each of these are worlds that are presented to our awareness. Now, humans have this remarkable capacity to move into another kind of attending. This is the second kind of minding, and this is where Dooyeweerd's category of the theoretical comes in. Once the world is being presented to us, we can then re-represent it in our consciousness. Presentation, representation. And that makes naive experience open to our reflection. We can now think on it. We can mind it in a different way. And this only happens after the world is being presented. And the moment we enter the kind of minding where we are beginning to think about something, the experience is now behind us. It's in the past, no longer in the real, but represented to us. And this is something Carl Jung understood. He said our cognition is really a recognition of what we already came to know in the first place. So we begin to cognate on it. Now, this is the kind of minding where we take control. In the first minding, our knowledge is rather passively received, but now we're fully engaged. We're reacting to what we've received. And that means we give it a much higher level of our attention. So we can begin to reflect on the sunset that we viewed on the beach. And perhaps in that reflection, we write a poem about it. Or after the film, a little break, and we begin to discuss the film, reflect on it, and say, I wonder what that meant. Or after the pre-reflective experience of a glass of wine, we can attend to it with words and description, another way of reflecting. Some people have marvelous imaginations in terms of how they reflect on wine. I read one that says, this has a brooding taste, an intensity like that of black cherry. That's the second minding. It's deeply reflective. So in this dimension of attending, we're making clear what was previously intuitive. Now, this account, this double minding, is actually backed up by how we understand how the brain works today. And this is laid out in the astonishing book that I've mentioned previously, the book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and Its Emissary. It's actually one of the most important books I've ever read, and I commend it to you. It's a long read, but it's worth the effort. Now, part of what McGilchrist does here is he develops a thesis that the brain is purposely designed for these two kinds of minding. And it's possible, this double minding, because we have a divided brain. The brain has two hemispheres, the right and the left. And he debunks, as most neuroscientists do today, the traditional understanding, left brain is for reason, right brain is for emotions. He said that's far too simplistic, and we know that now. And he says, actually, these two hemispheres are for two different ways of attending and minding the worlds. The right hemisphere is designed for the first kind of minding, and the left does the second kind. So the right hemisphere actually has direct access to the world, or to our multiple worlds. And through the right hemisphere, we encounter whatever world we happen to be occupying and whatever field of relation we're in. So the right side of the brain works by focusing out. And in doing that, it takes in the whole. And it works by the principle of an unfiltered minding. The left hemisphere works in the opposite direction. This is the divided brain. Here there's a narrowing in. The left hemisphere gives focus, specific focus, and it performs what McGilchrist calls an unworlding, because now our minding is a very filtered kind. So that allows for an implicit mind, the implicit minding of the right hemisphere, to become explicit in the left. And McGilchrist actually uses the analogy of a radio receiver to explain this. He said the left brain is like a radio that can only be tuned into one wavelength at a time. But that filtering, that restriction imposed on the right hemisphere is not just a limitation, he says, in the negative sense, any more than being able to transmit one program at any one time is a negative quality in a radio. Such limitation is a condition of its functioning at all. And from it, something particular is permitted to come into being for us. So where the right side, the right hemisphere, is concerned with what it experiences in the real world, and it delivers that to us, the left is concerned with what it can know. And here it becomes much more abstract. So McGilchrist shows that where the right hemisphere has an affinity for what's living, the left hemisphere has an affinity for what he calls is bloodless. Because the right hemisphere, he says, sees nothing in the abstract, but always appreciates things in their context, it is interested in the personal, by contrast with the left hemisphere, which has more affinity for the abstract or impersonal. Now, the key to appreciate here is that both hemispheres in the divided brain are essential for our minding the worlds. The right hemisphere gives direct access to reality as it's presented to us. The left enables us to make sense of the world that is presented then, to give clarity of what's happened first. And when this kind of minding has occurred, we navigate the world more consciously, more attentively. And we can do this because the world we're minding has come under the spotlight of our attention. That's what left hemisphere brings. And now that the mind is filtering to make sense of the world, we can actually use it. It brings utility to us. This is where our power and control over the world comes from left brain hemisphere function. And that, of course, is a wonderful benefit. Again, in McGilchrist's words, by this selection, this narrowing is once again not a diminution, but an increase. By restricting or selecting, something new that was not there before comes into being. The process is like sculpture, in which a thing comes into being through something else being pared away. So this is the narrow focus where other things fall away. So to summarize, McGilchrist again, each hemisphere attends to the world in a different way, and the ways are consistent. The right hemisphere underwrites breadth and flexibility of attention, where the left hemisphere brings to bear focused attention. This has the related consequence that the right hemisphere sees things whole and in their context, where the left hemisphere sees things abstracted from context and broken into parts, from which it then reconstructs a whole, something very different. Now, where both these forms of minding are essential to our knowing the world, there's an order here. And McGilchrist gets at this with the title of his book, the analogy of the master and its emissary. The right hemisphere is the master as it engages the real world, it engages real life, and then it sends forth its emissary, its envoy, to make sense of it. And McGilchrist says that the left hemisphere, the mediator of division, is never an endpoint, but always a staging post. It is a useful department to send things to for processing, but the thing only has meaning, once again, when they are returned to the right hemisphere. There needs to be a process of reintegration whereby we return to the experiential world again. The right hemisphere has precedence in that it underwrites the knowledge that the other comes to have, and is alone able to synthesize what both know into a usable whole. And Ian McGilchrist uses this delightful analogy to help us grasp the priority of relationship here. He said it's the difference between living and reading. Of course, it's possible to live without reading a book, but you can actually live in a book. But of course, one's life is greatly enhanced by reading, because life goes into a book. But the whole point of reading is meant to bring us back into a fuller richness of life. So that means the relationship is not equal or symmetrical. We read for living. And it's the same with the left hemisphere. We process, we reflect, we give our attention to in order to go back to real living. And that is what our minding is for. So to summarize what we've covered so far, humans have a rich inner life principle that extends the horizon of our knowing. And that includes multiple horizons and multiple worlds. And it's the richness of our inner life that corresponds to this richness of the field of relations that we can react to. That's the first point we made. And then in terms of how we mind the world, firstly, a world is presented to us, one that we have direct access to through the right hemisphere, and that's in real life and prior to reflection. But we also have this capacity to home in and give a part of the world our narrow attention. And it's that makes sense of the world so we can know it in a deeper way. So our brains are designed for this double minding, and that's how we mind the worlds. Now, in the final section of this talk, I want to lay out briefly 3 classes of knowledge as we mind the world. As we attend to the world with these multiple horizons, 3 classes of knowledge come up. And we live in these 3 classes. And I think it's helpful to name them. So the 3 classes of knowledge as we mind the world. Firstly, I'm going to call it propositional knowledge. Now, here we return to the work of the left hemisphere. The knowledge we get here is narrow and out of filtered attention, and it renders the kind of knowledge that can be laid down in a kind of description. So the knowledge that is delivered here can be put into a proposition. The proposition is abstract, but it also brings clear focus. It pinpoints something. There's a fixing of something for a certain view of the world. Now, there are different kinds of propositions. Equations and theorems would be one type. These are forms of knowledge and propositions that work in logic. So in the world of mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2. That's the proposition. Propositional knowledge can also take the form of sentences. Take the famous syllogism, Socrates is a man. All men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. It's another kind of proposition which is rooted in logic. There are other kinds of propositions that just form simple sentences. You might tell me it's raining outside. That's a proposition. Now, the wonderful advantage of a proposition is that it offers the possibility of validation. When anything in the world is pinpointed into a proposition, it can be tested to see if it's true or false. So if you tell me it's raining outside, I can go to the window and I look outside and sure enough, it's raining again. Now, because of propositional knowledge, it's possible for us as humans to access truth about reality. Propositions give the possibility of truth, real truth, and we need them for truth. As Francis Schaeffer, the great Christian thinker, loved to say, truth that's sufficient, because it's real, it's true truth, he said, but not exhaustive. The horizons are so wondrous, we can never get to the end of it, but we can have sufficient truth because of propositions. So the nature of a proposition is that it offers a basis for truth, and what we traditionally used to refer to as objective truths, which can be misleading, but I still think it's a useful term. Propositional knowledge allows for as little of the subject to be in the equation as possible. The subject's never completely removed because knowledge, of course, is always in us. We are the truth holders. But because it's in a proposition of some kind, it can be tested and validated. And that validation is quite apart from whether or not we'd like the outcome as subjects. So actually, reality becomes the truth maker. Proposition, validation, by testing it with reality, truth. So imagine that's what's being tested in your life is connected to your bank balance. your accountant comes to you and makes the proposition that you are bankrupt. Now, that has to be tested and proved either true and false. And subjectively, you might not like the truth if you are indeed bankrupt, as the accountant can prove and show and validate, but you do well to actually receive that truth because it's objective. So we should never diminish the wonder of knowledge that comes through propositions. It delivers us truth, and truth gives deeper lucidity to the worlds that we occupy, that we can react to, our field of relations. And that helps us to navigate the world in truth, which is such a precious gift. So while stating the importance of this, I know in no way want to diminish propositional knowledge. I also want to say that it was never meant to be the end point of our knowing. And that's because it's knowledge in the realm of the abstract. It's the staging post of the left hemisphere that allows us to think about the world, but not to stay there. If you like, it's the book, the proposition is the book to help us discover the world, to discover its truth. But having discovered the truth, we then have to go back into the real worlds. It's a good thing to remember that all abstractions are thinner than reality. Abstraction is not real life. That's why Albert Einstein quipped that he just loved abstractions, because nothing really troubled him in a world of abstractions. He even said it freed him from the reality of a nagging wife out there in the real worlds. So while propositional knowledge is an essential part of our minding the world, it's not the only knowing we need. And this is really important to stress today, because we live in a moment where this kind of knowing dominates. And it's actually in this is the big thesis that the McGilchrist is developing in The Master in Its Emissary. After showing us how the brain works, the second part of the book is saying that in the making of the modern world, the left hemisphere colonized our brain. And it did that with detrimental consequences. We have made abstract knowledge the complete package. And this was rooted back to the Enlightenment vision of the world. It was ours to conquer by knowing it completely in a specific way. As Ernest Becker puts it in his book, The Birth and Death of Meaning. At the Enlightenment, man said this is how reality really works and what the real world is really like and how things really work. This is the whole premise of modern science, to banish illusion from the world. And this is applied to both the physical and the social worlds. And the point is, we accomplish this by giving preference to the left hemisphere, which does a wonderful job, but we did that to the neglect of the right hemisphere. Remember, the left hemisphere de-worlds reality. It narrows things down so we can get control over it. Now, that's precisely what the scientific enterprise does, and it's what it's for. But the point is, if we don't make a return to the real world, then everything's going to become mechanical. Everything is going to become depersonalized and dehumanized. And actually, McGilchrist makes this point. He says, science adopts a view of its object from which everything human has, as far as possible, been removed. There's no reason to see that particular way as privilege, except that it enables us to do certain things more easily, to use things, to have power over things, the preoccupation of the left hemisphere. And this is one of the great ironies of the modern world. We've privileged a certain kind of knowing for the benefit of our control, but in the process, we have dehumanized ourselves as the knowers. And this dehumanization by privileging abstraction over real life has led to a certain kind of madness, especially in the 21st century. I think the abstract worlds that we have created has created a certain kind of madness. G.K. Chesterton understood this, that where the basically left hemisphere is dominant, madness comes. He said, the madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason. He functions in left hemisphere and by abstraction alone. And I think today, without knowing why, many are feeling the squeeze of this madness. Everything is pushed into abstraction and dead facts. So our world has become bloodless and lifeless, and that includes us, the account of who we are, as we've seen in some of my previous talks. Now, I think when we have a clear-sighted understanding of how we mind the world as humans, we can give propositional knowledge its proper place. This is a God-given faculty that allows us to know what is true about our world. But even as we know the world like this, we acknowledge there's more to life than abstraction. So that's the first class of knowledge. The second class is knowledge as wisdom. And here's a kind of knowing that's more than logic. Wisdom is a knowledge that grants a deeper insight into the real. Again, as McGilchrist puts it, whatever the left hemisphere may add, and it adds enormously much, it needs to return what it sees to the world that is grounded by the right hemisphere. And I think a knowledge as wisdom is this grounding, as we have direct access to the real worlds. So when we mind the world in a healthy way, we know our abstractions are wonderful, but they're less than life. And wisdom allows us to hear the appeal of the living, to be stimulated by it, and on the basis of the truth we've discovered in propositions, to live it out in the real worlds. And that's just what wisdom is for. It leads us into a knowing with greater depth and fullness. It is what I call depth insight. And it's a knowledge that's integrated to the real world, the world that's delivered to us by the right hemisphere. Abraham Joshua Heschel gets at this with his characteristic clarity. He says, where man meets the world, not with the tools he has made, but with the soul with which he was born, not like a hunter who seeks his prey, but like a lover to reciprocate love, where man and matter meet as equals before the mystery, both made, maintained, and destined to pass away, it is not an object, a thing that is given to his sense, but a state of fellowship that embraces him and all things. Wisdom is this deeper insight that grounds us into a world that's personal. So when we've minded the world and received wisdom, we can now live more fully in the real world, and that includes all of its horizons. And this brings us back to last week. I looked at our 10 wondrous capacities. To live in wisdom is to have all of our capacities engaged. We've stood back and we've reflected well on the world that's presented to us, and then we return there to really live in it. So that includes a depth of our feeling for what's happening in the real world. Wisdom includes our feeling. It's a wisdom that includes our speaking. It's how we respond to the world that addresses and speaks to us. Wisdom is a return use of our words that corresponds to that address. It's sympathetic to the world. And that would include, this is speaking to me, limiting our use of hyperbole. Wisdom doesn't overstate things. It's an appropriate response to the real world. I think hyperbolists are those who live too much in abstraction, and they can make outlandishly extreme statements. Wisdom makes us moderate in terms of how we use words. And then wisdom impacts how we act upon the world. Another capacity we looked at last week. Our intentions, our actions line up with reality. So it's wisdom that says, don't jump off that cliff. It's a bad choice. Or it says, don't throw that crisp packet out of the window of your car. That's a bad action. Wisdom enables us to act on the world responsibly within our limits and the limits of the world. That's what wisdom imparts in the real world. Then knowledge as wisdom includes how we're going to handle our property. I said last week that our property becomes part of us, but we recognize, if we're wise, that our possessions are not us. They become part of us, but they don't define us. So we can hold our possessions lightly. That's a wise way of handling possessions. And then knowledge and wisdom inflames our imagination. We don't just think the world in a realm outside of space and time. We respond to the beauty of the various worlds and horizons that engage us. And when we see ugliness and it's all around us, we feel the distortion. That's a wise use of our imagination. And we can do that because, again, we're in the real world. And then knowledge as wisdom has this special sensitivity to morality and to virtue. Our moral conscience is activated and engaged. We're not just theoretically moral. And that means in any given moment, we can be good, good according to norms of right and wrong. And that makes us wise. And actually, when the moral good becomes our habit, the habit of our inner life, we become virtuous. That's what a wise person is. And then so it goes on. Knowledge as wisdom allows us to love. We can bless others with our love. Love doesn't work in syllogisms. It has to be out in the world. And knowledge as wisdom makes that possible. And then ultimately, knowledge as wisdom engages our capacity for God. As I said last week, we can orient our lives to Him in our limitation, knowing we need to trust something or someone that transcends our limitation. And that's why the Bible asserts that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And that means acknowledging His unlimited nature, his otherness, which is so awesome. It puts us in a bit of a tremor. Wisdom begins there. So that's the point. Wisdom in the real world and knowledge as wisdom actually engages us for a deeper insight in terms of how we live. Well, that leads to my final and third class of knowledge, which I call intersubjective knowing. Now, I touched on this also in a previous talk. This is our capacity for interpersonal relationship. To be human, I've said, is to have multiple worlds. We have fields of relations for our reactivity. And here we reach the best of all worlds, to be in relationship with others like us. So to mind the world of another person is really to reach the top of Everest. It's the highest knowledge that we are capable of having. And it's a world so full of wonder that all the other worlds fall away. Buber makes this point in his great book, I, Thou. He says, the you fills the horizon. It becomes a complete world that we begin to mind. And I would suggest there's nothing more real than the world of another person, a person who can be known, we can have a relationship with. And Buber says that such a world exists beyond any kind of categorization we can give it. And that's so notable, especially for today. To engage a knowledge that's interpersonal gets us beyond the threshold of gender and race and sex, which so much is reduced today in terms of human life and human identity. Think of critical race theory and theories around sexual orientation. These are just mere abstractions of persons. They're not the real thing. They're abstract and they're bloodless. They're denatured, and we shouldn't buy into them. And they're actually deeply injurious to intersubjective knowledge. It's another colonization of the left hemisphere, and it's dominant today. So we need to know persons in the real worlds. And as McGilchrist highlights, that the right temporal region appears to have areas not only specific for living things, but additionally for all that is specifically human. The right hemisphere is designed for the specifically human, the personal. And it's interesting that neuroscience has discovered that the right hemisphere is where our ability to recognize faces come from. And the intersubjective is all about this, face to face. Faces themselves are whole worlds to mind, to attend to. They're not just a strange assemblage of parts. This is where the person is revealed. I've got a picture. Isn't that lovely? That dear old man. Look at that face. Ah, so moving. Many have said you look into a person's face, you look into their eyes, and it's like a window into their soul. It's a glimpse into the within. Not quite the same. I'm sticking with that one. I like the other one, but there's something about a human face. So by minding the world of a person, their face and their eyes, there's a horizon that leads us to fly out of our limits. And there we're confronted by the wonder and enchantment of what a human person is. Now, I think in our moment of left hemisphere dominance, we easily abstract people. And we miss this personal dimension. We fail to meet persons as they wholly are. And this is lost as we filter them and we abstract them into categories. Oh, that person's liberal. That person's right, conservative. Oh, that's LGBT. That person's homophobic. That person's a religious nut. That's an atheist. And on it goes. We miss persons. As Heschel says, how rarely do we face a person as a person? We are all dominated by the desire to appropriate and to own. That means control. Only a free person knows that the true meaning of existence is experienced in giving, in endowing, in meeting a person face to face, and fulfilling other people's needs. So it's this class of knowing and minding, the intersubjective, that we discover, where we discover the most astonishing truth about us as knowledge seekers. Here's a horizon, a world which is beyond anything that we can put words to. And actually, and this is my final point, we really do have access to an interpersonal world which is beyond this world's. And this person has a name. And the name of this person is God, Yahweh, the Lord. We call him Father, we call him Son, we call him Holy Spirit. And it is possible to know this God intersubjectively. Not to know him just as a theory. If we mind God theoretically, it only goes so far, as the God of the philosophers has revealed. The philosophers could only get so far as they mind God, but he's a person. And he can be known in this third class of knowledge. And if I can just be personal for a moment, I know this is a possibility because I know God like this. Not just as theory, not just as doctrine, but on the intersubjective, interpersonal level. It's the greatest honor and privilege that one can have, the greatest honor and privilege of my life. And we never get to the end of this intersubjective knowledge that we can have of the true and living God. So 3 classes of knowledge, the propositional, so important, so vital for truth, to navigate reality well. Then knowledge is wisdom that reintegrates us into the world in its fullness with depth in insight. And then the possibility of intersubjective knowledge, the top of Everest, what we're really made for. I, thou, I, you, knowing another person face to face. Good. Well, let me leave it there. Thank you for your attention. And over to you, Josh.
Thank you ever so much, Andrew. We're going to move now to a 5-minute intermission. During this time, feel free to let your left hemisphere have a bit of a stretch, report back before sending it forth again with some questions in 5 minutes' time. So I make it 8:21, so we'll reconvene at 8:26. You can ask questions with the Q&A tab. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's just on the bottom right of your screen. Or when we reconvene, feel free to raise your hand by clicking on your own name, and I'll be able to hand you the mic, as it were, to ask a question live. Wonderful. We'll see you in 5 minutes. We've got a question from Elizabeth, who says, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, where would the world of dreams fit into the different hemispheres of knowledge?
Yeah, McGilchrist, thank you, Elizabeth. Good question. McGilchrist does address that, and it happens on both sides, if I recall his argument correctly. But yeah, dreams are a fascinating thing for me. Again, another world. And it's more unconscious minding. And I think because of the way a dream works, you can definitely see how the right hemisphere works in it, because it's whole. Things aren't divided up and particularized. But yeah, the world of dreams. I don't think I can say much more than that. But I like with most functions, the divided brain, it's both doing something. It's going back and forth. But I like to think about how it works on the right side. But I've written the question down. I need to think about that one more.
Got a question from got a few questions from an anonymous attendee. I'm going to put this one to you first, Andrew. Right at the end, you spoke about your own faith in God. So the question is, how do you know that you have a personal relationship with God? Isn't this just blind faith?
Mhm.
I'm going to link it with the third question also asked by this person. Would you agree an autistic person who struggles to form human relationships will see intersubjective knowing as not important as you do? I suppose the connection.
Good, thank you.
Hmm.
Yep. I think it's well known that someone with autism has more of a struggle on the interpersonal side. And McGilchrist goes into some detail about what is going on in the hemispheres there, and there is a certain colonization of the left that often shows itself in someone who has autism. Yeah, as you heard, when it comes to propositions, I think validation is possible. In fact, I think many things can be tested and validated within a proposition. Reducing a personal God to a proposition is impossible. In fact, to reduce any person to a proposition is impossible. So intersubjective knowledge is not something that one can give an easy proof for. I would say the evidence I would give for knowing God out of my own experience would be certain transformations in my own life that have come from that encounter. Because I think when I and you, two persons, meet each other, the dynamic relationship there for change and transformation is huge, for good or for bad. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that I am a really good person. I think my wife would testify to this. I've become a better person for knowing this God and knowing him interpersonally. And for me, being in an interpersonal relationship, having that kind of knowledge, it has communication at the heart of it. We get back to language. And in a sense, this is very Sunday school-like, but God speaks to me as I read his word, and it doesn't happen every day, but as I engage his word, which I believe is a living word addressed to me, I sense that I have been communicated to at a very deep and personal level. And then when I turn around and communicate with God, give a word back, which is what prayer is about, there's also a sense that I've been listened to. And actually, the engagement with God in prayer changes us more than anything else. It does change circumstances. God answers prayers, and occasionally I see evidence of that. So I think there are certain evidences that I would put in my story in terms of this interpersonal relationship. But if you ask me for a proof, I would struggle to do that, as I would, in a sense, to give a proof about the nature of an interpersonal relationship with any other person. It's very easy to reduce someone to an it, and to make them less than a person, as I said in my finishing up of the lecture. But that's a very good question. Thank you.
Got two similar questions that I'll link together. One from James Goodwin Hudson. Thank you for the series. How should the three types of knowledge affect our preaching? In my Christian circles, there's a big emphasis on propositional knowledge and little on the other two. And I'm going to link that to a question from Matt Peckham, who says, how can we get better at our wisdom knowledge and joining head knowledge to our hearts?
Yeah, both very, very good question. In terms of how to attain wisdom, we have to engage real life, and that's going to mean different things for each of us depending on where we're coming from. If someone is an academic, it might mean taking up a very practical hobby, restoring furniture, whittling a piece of wood. Someone I admire a huge amount said walking on grass barefoot can do a lot for a person who lives in their heads. So yeah, I think this addresses your question, Matt. I think there is something about our engagement with art that takes us out of the purely theoretical. If we're living 8 hours on screen in the digital worlds, we're not likely to gain wisdom. And I think the fight of our lives today is the fight to be in the real. But then you know this well. I think we have to read the Bible for wisdom. There are many propositional truths in the Bible, and we have to stand on those. This is truth. But I think and this maybe comes to the first question, James's question. I think the Bible is wisdom from beginning to end. It's all about integrating us to the real world. And I think if our preaching isn't connecting to life, we need doctrine. That's why I do not want to dismiss propositions. And I'd say in your church context, James, maybe many only live in propositions. I'm meeting more and more Christians who don't have much propositional content to their beliefs. So I think that needs to be in place. But on the basis of that, we live it, we practice it in whatever direction it goes. And for me, preaching that isn't engaging culture, isn't engaging the needs of our time, especially around our mental health issues, our problems of meaning, our self-obsessions, it's not going to touch real life. And I don't think there's any substitute for those of us who are teachers than ourselves being committed to knowledge as wisdom. And for those of you who are Christians, the Bible actually says we can ask for wisdom. The Holy Spirit doesn't want to take us out of the real world. He wants to integrate us as fully as possible into reality, and that's one of his missions, one of his works in our life.
This sort of links on to the answer you've just given. Richard Goodwin asks you to say a little more about the relationship between propositions and reality. He says he likes the way Udo Middleman said once that reality is greater than any description of that reality. Just to maybe spin off that question, Andrew, you've highlighted the importance of propositions. Would you say that reality isn't reducible to propositions, but nevertheless they have a place?
Yes. And the fact is, reality is so full. So this is back to our inner life principle is so rich that we can engage multiple horizons. So that makes reality so great, so stupendous that millions of propositions wouldn't exhaust the nature of the real. But that doesn't mean we shy away from them. One of the huge values of science is that it grants us more knowledge of the natural world, knowledge that can be propositionalized, and that's wonderful. So in a sense, the knowledge enterprise will never end on the propositional side, but the propositions are only to make sense of reality. And I think sometimes we lose that order. We put propositions of truth in place to understand the real. So that's where I like the idea of the master and its emissary, the envoy. We send forth a command to the envoy of the left to make sense of it, and then it comes back and we come into real life again. So that order has to be in place.
I've got a question here from Jennifer Lan, who asks, how can we stay connected to others at times like this, when we're going through screens, using a lot of data, and our interactions mediated through algorithms? How can intersubjective knowledge flourish through digital means, and how can we truly make personal contact, if that were the only temporal option, if using these media is the only thing we can do? Got any suggestions, Andrew?
Oh, you've put me on the spot there. I mean, It is a means of communication. And in these times when we are having to isolate from each other, we should be thankful for it, but should never get used to it. That's what I would say. It is so far from a true face to face. And I've enjoyed being able to communicate with you on a Friday evening. And I'm thankful for the way it has worked, but I can't tell you how much I miss teaching in a face-to-face situation, and especially in this discussion time. I find it quite painful not to see another person's face as one engages a question. So I would say, let's hope we never get used to it. Someone said the other day, it's going to be strange getting you going back to church in normal relationship. I said, it's not going to be hard for me to get used to it. I'm just longing for it. But I would say, within the measures that have been mandated, we should make every opportunity every day to have a face-to-face. It needs to be out in public in a park for a walk, but without it, I think we begin to die. And this is debatable, but I've done a lot of work with Martin Buber's thinking and philosophy, and I do argue that the digital is not a medium for a true I thou. It inhibits that. It's something two persons are communicating, but without the face to face. And there's the visual side of it. That's why I showed the picture of the old man. You gaze into the world. You can see it. It's just not the same on a screen. So we have to pray for each other, those of us who are Christians, that we'll get through this.
Just one more question from our anonymous attendee. It's a good question. It's one I've heard in other contexts. They're asking, you said something about the knowledge of God or the fear of God being the beginning of wisdom. The question is, are all non-Christians unwise?
No. The word wisdom, especially in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, it fits into my definition of depth, insight, but it's quite clear that it has a moral tone to it, that the wise person is morally fitted for a world that takes God seriously as first principle, and the fool is someone who doesn't. So that's how it's set up in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. But I would not assert that only a Christian is capable of wisdom. I read lots of thinkers, philosophers, engage lots of artists who share their wisdom, and I'd say that wisdom is a gift of God. That's what we call God's common grace, and benefit from it enormously. But I would say the highest wisdom we were created for, it's the beginning at one level, but it's also the height, is this intersubjective relationship with God. And there is a fear, a true fear in that engagement with God because of who he is. But knowing that, the nature of who God is as a person, so much flows from that. Good question.
One more from Richard Goodwin, who asks whether you could talk about poetry as a form of knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. I would. A poem is not a proposition. Lewis did some good work on that. His famous essay, Is Theology Poetry? And he ended up by saying he didn't think it was. And I agree with him. I got at this a little bit. We're addressed by a beautiful sunset. We reflect on it. That reflection can give rise to a poem. I think there's something about poetics or any art form, any aesthetic, that actually is the means to reintegrating us back to reality. I think I don't want to put imagination on the right side alone, but I think when our imagination is firing, we are back closer to a direct access to reality. So yep, it is a real knowledge, but I'd put that more in knowledge of wisdom. All of our capacities in their fullness are functioning and firing, and that includes the imagination, our capacity to see beauty, but also to appreciate ugliness when there's a distortion of the world.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We've reached the end of our time together this evening. Thank you so much for joining us to think about thinking, to learn about learning, and to minding. Just to let you know that next week we'll be shifting gears slightly. The title for Andrew's talk next week is, it's a very good title, and it's just gone out of my mind. Andrew, would you mind jogging my memory? It's on Spinoza.
It's fundamentally desire. We're looking at desire, aren't we? Humans is fundamentally desiring. These restless hearts. Yeah.
There we are. So same time, same place next week, except a different link. So if you haven't yet signed up, please do so on our events page. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've got any questions during the week about the format, any suggestions, please do feel free to email me. My email will be on the confirmation email you received for this. And from all of us at Christian Heritage, we hope you have a wonderful week, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.
Farewell. Thank you.